So tell us about your ink experience. How much of a disruption did you cause in the session?
Well, we'll see. I won't know until I talk to people afterwards. But yeah, I had a great time sharing my project on mind-controlling parasites that I photographed for National Geographic magazine.
So what made you share this experience at Ink, and what was the purpose of sharing your story at Ink?
Well, my goal as a photographer is to use images to change how people relate to natural history subjects, and so that's my main motivation for doing the project. Was to show these creatures that people tend to dismiss as gross, disgusting. Why would I want to learn about that? Well, we have a lot to learn from these creatures. That was the motivation for taking the pictures in the first place. And the only reason to take pictures is to then share the stories that you've covered with as broad an audience as possible. So when Lakshmi asked me to come to share the story, I was happy to do it, to share the story with as many people as I could.
So what do you expect that people will take away from the story apart from the wonderful dubstep video?
I want people to think parasites are cool. That's my goal.
And talking about mind control, how much of a leeway and how much of a headway have you made into discovering the mind controlling power of parasites?
Well, my role is not as much to be a researcher. I'm not actively studying how these organisms interact. My job is as a communicator, so I work with the scientists who are studying them, and then I try to take their discoveries and make them more accessible. Okay. So there's a number of different labs across the world that I visited that are working on this, many more that I didn't visit, and they're working every day to try to work out these details of these interactions. But I think we have a long ways to go.
Okay. So generally when we think about Nat Geo photographers or general nature photographers, a lot of onus is given on photographing things in their natural element, but we saw a very different process. So can you take us through that process?
Well, I think there's value in showing a creature in its environment and its habitat and context. But there's also value in stripping away that context and focusing very much on the creature itself. And especially in these cases where the creatures are very small, their interactions are very complex. People don't want to see pictures of parasites, especially not one creature coming out of another creature. Yeah. And so I use this approach to try to find a way to show some beauty in these creatures. And I did that by stripping away the background and developing this sort of lighting aesthetic that can draw your attention to where the action was happening. Light up the parasite, leave the host in shadow. And that was my motivation for doing that.
So you said that your work is to communicate, the work of these creatures and communicate science. So do you try to make it a little simpler and easier to digest and absorb, or for the general public?
That's the greatest challenge of my work, is figuring out how to make it simple without oversimplifying. I mean, it's important to figure out where in this story are people able to connect and emphasize those points of connection and allow people to then discover however much more of the complexity and details that they're interested in. Okay. And it's very challenging to do that without producing an inaccurate story or oversimplifying or making incorrect connections in order to try to make it simple. And I think that's the juggling process of a science storyteller, science photographer, is to know what is oversimplification versus what is accessible to a broad audience who doesn't have a science background.
So how do you reach out to that broad audience? Of course, your work does get published in Nat Geo and magazines and stuff, but what other mediums do you use?
Well, I create videos that go out on YouTube and they get shared on the web. I give a lot of talks, and so a lot of times, when you're on the web, there's so much engaging material. It's easy to sort of skip over anything that looks weird or different. And the same as in magazines. You get to choose where you put your attention. Whereas if you go to a talk or a live presentation, you're choosing to go to that presentation, but for the rest of the time, it's out of your control how much time and what's coming in. And so those are really valuable opportunities to connect with people and show them the whole story and get them past their filter of parasites are gross and show them how cool this stuff is. So I think it takes you can't reach 40 million people one-on-one, but it's good to have a mix of online content and in-person presentations as well.
So since I work in online, my interest will be in how do you reach out to people digitally, and how much of a difference does it make to your work, and does it make it simple to kind of just put a video on YouTube and have it reach out to people, or how do you use it to your advantage?
It can be tricky. For example, the dubstep video, I think it works much better in the context of the rest of the story. When you find it by itself and it's just bug pictures and thumping music, I think people don't react to it the same way. And so I have to be a little bit selective about what can stand on its own and can be appreciated and can be valuable and educational as a standalone 30-second clip, a standalone photograph, and what else has to be packaged as a story.
Okay.
And so I'm looking to share these things both as stories for somebody who's willing to invest some more of their time, as well as little teasers that may point back to that story and catch somebody's attention as they're browsing something else, looking for a distraction, and maybe draw them into a deeper conversation.
Okay. What's your favorite project that you worked on?
This is probably it. I mean, in some ways, it's been the greatest challenge and the most rewarding project I've done.
So how do you plan to pan out your future in terms of?
I mean, I have a series of projects I'm working on. The ones that have been funded by National Geographic, I can't talk about in detail, but basically they're variations of different science stories where I've biologists that I've been working with since I was a student, or since I've met since then, who are working on really interesting projects. Sometimes they're subjects that are very poorly known, like these mind-controlling parasites. In other cases, they're much more familiar subjects, but I'm taking a new angle on them and say, hey, look, you've seen a million pictures of this bird or this frog, but what you didn't know is all this crazy science that we're understanding with modern scientific tools. So I'm always working very closely with researchers, biologists, and my goal is to both show the creatures, their behavior, their natural history, and the fascinating scientific tools that we use to study their biology.
Thank you so much.